All right. So I have not done this before, so you'll have to give me a second. We need to go to View and Presentation, and hopefully this works. So I'm Jordan, and this is my presentation on abstinence-only sex education. So I wanted to cover a few things before I got started. One of them is that some of my resources are a little older. I attempted to find newer resources, but for a very specific reason, those were mostly a little out of date. So I just wanted to be perfectly upfront about that and be clear about that. But like I said, there's a very good reason for that I'll go into when I hit the timeline slide. So going from there, Abstinence Only got rebranded sometime around 2010 or 2015, sorry, as sexual risk avoidance. That's something that's not really well covered in the resources, but it is mentioned by a few different resources that I was able to find and locate. Basically, the goals of these programs is to have people refrain from sexual activity until they can get married. Specifically, most of the research I did find was very much about early education programs with teenagers, adolescents, young adults, that kind of a thing. The reason those programs were the most common was because, am I recording? I'm going to stop this right now and see if I'm recording. Okay, I have been recording. Okay, cool. Page is accessing your microphone. Cool. Sorry. Like I said, haven't done this before, so my apologies. So basically, the goal of the program is keep you from engaging in sexual activity until you get married. And that's actually a lot of the underpinning of the programs. When I say the program specifically, there's a few of them. For instance, Section 510 under the Social Security Act basically has codes that you have to use in order to meet the criteria to get the grant money. And one of those is that you advocate for people to wait until marriage. The idea behind this is that if you wait until marriage, then you might only end up with one sexual partner, which would create a lack of sexual interactions with anyone else, and that would mean that you are safe from STDs and unwanted pregnancy, at least in theory. So in this slide, I discuss the definition. I also discuss the fact that these policies are a bit controversial, especially since they are tied with federal funding. That's it's got a lot of problems around that specifically. And some of them have even gone as far as to use moral terms such as chaste or virgin, which is a pretty harsh moral judgment, in my mind anyways. It does bring up several issues that seem to vary from author to author. For instance, what counts as sexual activity? There's some moral ambiguity about how it treats the people it's educating, for instance, even though it's supposedly some of the newer ones, the SRAs, tend to avoid using shaming language. However, they still have this idea that they portray with some of these programs that if you have sex ahead of being in a committed relationship, that you are going to spoil yourself. And that's what I meant by moral ambiguity. It's very much a cultural judgment that is funded with federal money. And that, for me, was kind of one of the big takeaways, but I'll get back into that later. These also often neglect LGBTQ relationships or any other sorts of sexual diversity. So that's a little bit morally questionable as well. So going to the next slide here. This is the timeline, and this is where I'm going to get into why the resources are a bit dated. So basically, it all started in 1981 with the Abstinence Family Life Act, AFLA. And that program basically set up the guidelines and some of the ideas that the government would basically pay for sex ed, which not revolutionary, but basically it set aside money for that. In 1996, Section 510 of the Social Security Act basically just kind of made sure that there were certain guidelines for that, which I'll get into in a little bit here. But that guideline has a lot and keeps kind of a moral judgment in it. So I'll get into that in the next slide. But the funding for these programs kept increasing all through the late 90s, early 2000s, up until 2004. A Democratic representative, a former head of, I think it was the Budgets and Means Committee. Either way, basically did a review of these programs and found that they contained incorrect scientific information. They didn't cover other forms of contraception. They had some just frank, inaccurate information that they specifically put as like a primary source in their information. They also they often stressed around that time frame. They were stressing the mental health problems of adolescent sex, which get into that a little later, I guess. And then in 2010, so in 2009, the budget proposal put out by the administration at the time basically switched all of the funding out of the Section 510 program and put it into other programs. So other things that fell under that sex ed umbrella. So basically they were killed or at least the federally financed versions of these programs were killed by basically taking away the money, giving it to other programs, and kind of that was a workaround to make sure that they didn't actually need to be changed or repealed or anything. Because that, at the time, because of political pressures, would have been too difficult. However, in 2015, the programs were relabeled as sexual risk avoidance, and the program funding was redistributed back into these same areas. Specifically, the Section 510, the Social Security Act. So By the way, it's not intentional that sexual risk avoidance is underlined. That just happens to be kind of how a thing in the program decided to put it. But yeah, that's the approximate timeline. And the reason why some of the research I found is very dated is because the research from 2015 on basically has all been conducted by rights advocacy groups such as Planned Parenthood, which are still fighting against the sexual risk avoidance education materials, and view it basically as an extension of the abstinence only kind of sex ed, which it effectively is. It just says that people should avoid sexual activity until they're either married or in a long-term relationship. So it's effectively the same. All right, moving on. So these are the guidelines that these programs operate under. This is the Section 510 guidelines I mentioned from 1996. So they have to have the exclusive purpose of teaching the health benefits of abstaining from sexual activity. They have to teach that abstinence from sexual activity outside of marriage is the expected standard for all school-age children, which, don't forget, this includes people in their later teens. Some of these programs even go outside of the school-age system, and they do like 18 to 22. So this is definitely something that a lot of people kind of grew up with, myself included. Teaches that abstinence from sexual activity is the only certain way to avoid out-of-wedlock pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. And other health problems. One of the things that we'll also see a lot here is that there's this information floating around that engaging in consensual premarital sex is unhealthy. And that's going to be just a lot of the information we're going to see is going to be very connected to that. So please keep in mind about that as well as we go forward. Sorry, I forgot which one I was on. Okay. So basically, they keep the monogamous relationships in the context of marriage, is once again the standard for human sexuality, which is also, I felt like this was a pretty hard cultural judgment, and definitely embodies a very Christian Eurocentric view. Or Western Christian centric view, however you want to view that. But so that's definitely seems to me to be a very kind of heavy-handed cultural judgment. It teaches that sexual activity outside of the context of marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects. So one of the associations that's made here pretty frequently is that premarital sex will create children, and then those children will create economic disparities, and then those disparities will result in psychological stress and physical, lack of physical well-being. Which does have some merit to it. Definitely, if you start looking at some of like poverty rates and generational poverty and things like that, you can really get into some areas where it becomes quite a trend, My mom actually was pregnant before she was done with high school, and my dad was just graduating from high school, or I think my dad had been in high school at that point too. My grandmother, same situation on my mom's side, early childhood stuff, and so it can really generate into these generational trends. However, the question of is abstinence the only path to prevent these trends from reoccurring is definitely up for discussion, I think. Um, so the next one's very much about like that same kind of pattern, that having children out of wedlock is a harmful consequence for the child and the parents and society in general. Mostly because it's assumed that if these people have children at a young age, they're going to need more financial assistance, which once again, there is some credibility to that. So that it kind of exists in this area that skirts on information, but is choosing to read it in a very biased way. So these programs also have a hard thing about rejecting sexual advances and avoiding alcohol and drugs because they can increase your risk of sexual activity, which there is some truth to the fact that these can create situations in which you are more vulnerable to sexual advances or inebriated from making otherwise the decisions that you normally would. Yeah. So then there's the fact that these they try to very much encourage that people gain self-sufficiency before engaging in sexual activity. So the underwriting theme for that I noticed from here was very much that people are encouraged to avoid sex. They are encouraged to just refrain from sex until they're married, which once again is a very big cultural piece. I feel like it's not something that I feel all cultures everywhere embrace, especially since marriage looks different in different societal situations. So how these programs often present themselves are they claim that they are the only method for preventing teen pregnancy. They're the only 100% effective method, which also discounts the non-consensual forms of sex like rape and molestation and things like that. Which it doesn't really address those issues either. So if someone were being raped and had a child in that situation, it would be seen as breaking abstinence, even though it wasn't consensual. So a lot of these programs aren't discussing that in a healthy way, at least in my opinion. So once again, they also double down on that, like having sex before marriage is a physical and psychological risk, as well as a social ill, which is kind of a little strange to me. Even though I grew up with these programs, I was kind of raised in such a way that I believed like sex is natural. It's what we're designed to do when we reach certain ages. Like, not that we're encouraged to have children at those ages in the current society, but that our bodies are something we're going to explore, especially as they're going through puberty and later life changes and stuff, and we're going to engage in those behaviors. So So the fact that it kind of associates a physical and psychological risk with something that I see as really natural is really kind of strange for me. The pamphlets created for these programs, I really wish I could have found some that were better quality images. I would have loved to included more than just the one on the screen here, because they are very awkward looking, and unfortunately, everything I found online that I managed to get my hands on was very blurry quality, and most of those were old abstinence programs. I was not able to find anything online that was an SRA program that was publicly available. I could have purchased some, but then I would be stuck with 50 or 500, depending on the minimum order size, of sexual risk avoidance pamphlets, which I just did not have an interest in purchasing. Many of these programs are also kind of associate having premarital sex as ruining your relationships or chances at happiness. Even future relationships outside of the one you engage in with sexual behaviors, they often are kind of projecting it as though if you have sexual relations, say at 16, then you will be affecting relationships you have in your late 20s, even if it was consensual and whatnot and everything was good. Which is strange once again to me. And I've looked at some of the information they present, and we'll go into that in the next slide, but it's just a very interesting thing. They also kind of define like masturbation and pornography as harmful, which is interesting because they're not just pushing for abstinence from sex as a consensual social activity. What they're doing is they're also saying that like masturbation and pornography are also in these social ills, which not every program does this. And I want to take a second here while I'm thinking about it to mention this. These programs, like Section 510, that is a federal grant issuing program. People apply for those grants, and then basically, as long as they meet those 8 requirements I showed you in the last slide, they can publish their materials and get the financing. The federal program entices states to engage in this by saying that for every dollar the state spends, the government will spend $1.33. So that's kind of it allows the states and even in some situations the towns or school districts to kind of make these things up on their own, so long as they meet the requirements. There's also some claims that by waiting for sex till you get in a long-term relationship, that it may last longer. And they also treat the having sex as inherently irresponsible, which for me was very strange to see them just kind of associating all sex as just this irresponsible action unless it takes place within the confines of marriage. SRA programs are a little different because when I say a little different, it's so they kind of had to reskin abstinence programs. And when they did, they conceded on a few different parts. And one of those was that it needed to have more scientific backing. So these programs had to have more educational materials about some other things, and or at least more scientific evidence. I apologize. They also had to address LGBTQ issues a little bit, but they kept that to be very minimal. They had to be mentioned, and the relationships weren't really discussed, or what those relationships might look like. It was just said that, the programs had to, or have to, I should say, since they're active, have to discuss it at least by acknowledging that that's another type of relationship. Now, it doesn't say that they have to educate people on like what those relationships might look like, if they're, who might be involved in them, or, any other information. It just says that they have to kind of tip their hat to it and move on. They also have to, I don't think I included this, but they are required to talk about at least a few other forms of contraception, which is good. Definitely progress in my eyes, but they're not required to go very in depth about that. So basically, as long as you include any other information, such as condom failure rates, which is the traditional tactic used by AOEs, which often they're pulling from information that's been gathered inappropriately. And those failure rates are much higher. One of the things that they will do is they'll take information about a subject, and they will find the most statistically favorable thing for their arguments, and they will only present that. So, for instance, if you're looking at condom failure rates, there's if they're appropriately applied and if they're inappropriately applied. And so they'll get the information based off of the inappropriately applied condoms, and then treat that like that is how all the failure rate for all condoms, which is obviously very misleading. And there's also a political element to this. A lot of more conservative groups are getting the grants and then publishing these. While researching these, I did even find ones that were included biblical references, which it's very strange to me to see that federal funding is basically going to promote religious view. So the criticisms of the program is that abstinence is difficult. Due to both personal and social pressures, and that abstinence-only programs often only showed the one method and would avoid discussing other ones. Those are the older programs. SRAs, of course, are required to talk about some of the other contraceptions, but once again, they're not required to discuss them in depth. These programs have been proven ineffective at preventing teen pregnancy or STIs. In fact, teens who actually use these programs, when they do eventually break abstinence, what ends up happening is they don't know enough about other forms of contraception to avoid pregnancy. And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in that kind of a way. You didn't educate people, the teens got pregnant, and now they help fuel the teen pregnancy ratio that you use to get more funding and you see how the pattern works. They often shame sexual activities, potentially stunting sexual growth of an individual. Speaking from personal experience here, my relationship to these programs is that I avoided any sort of sexual exploration for years, longer than I think I might have otherwise, maybe even as much as like a decade longer than I would have otherwise. And because of that, I didn't ever try to work on my own gender identity, which was a problem for me. And it created a lot of distress for me because I had never been given an education that was inclusive, or for that matter, open about these sorts of things. It was just refrain from doing it, otherwise you'll get STDs and you'll get somebody pregnant or whatever. These programs, this is true more of the older programs, but the AOEs, conflate non-heterosexual behaviors with STIs, as well as kind of consider them to be unnatural or deviant. And that increases the stigma, especially if you consider the fact that who they're targeting with this is young adults in school settings. So if the sex ed is indicating that these things weren't acceptable, because most of the AOEs are completely gone, and now they're using SRAs, which are slightly friendlier, but if those programs had been pushing this idea that anything other than heterosexual activity is not acceptable, then that kind of is going to reinforce any stigmas that the students have. So that's bad for the LGBT community. Many abstinence programs also avoid teaching about any other forms of contraception. In fact, several of them even go out of their way to discuss how abortion has major psychological traumas associated with it, which when I was reviewing the information, that's once again some very cherry-picked data, because having a child, having a child actually causes more psychological distress, at least from what I've read, than having an abortion. So once again, they kind of cherry pick their data, and that's the theme that we kind of come into with this a lot, is that these programs are often choosing how to read the data rather than letting the data kind of direct their efforts. As mentioned priorly, when they're discussing contraception, often that's only in terms of the failure rates. So they'll mention like the side effects of the pill or the failure rates of condoms, but they won't tell you that, condoms have a 96% success rate, which I think my information on that's actually way out of date too. But once again, the goal of these programs is to promote sex only after marriage, which is, once again, specifically in the 510 guidelines, which is just strange. So these programs are often based on biased studies that have flaws in their methodology and are specifically politically motivated. One of the groups that was big into the AOEs was the Heritage Foundation, which, if you're not familiar with, they're definitely a very biased organization and tend to present information in such a way that they can, they're using the information, they're cherry picking their information to create a narrative that suits their needs and wants. Um, one of the major things they'll discuss is that that premarital sex causes depression or increases suicide risk. And while that's probably true, if you had also educated these people on, say, condoms or the pill or things like that, they might not have had a child, which is probably the source of that distress and the depression and those suicidal behaviors. So once again, they're kind of picking their information to back the abstinence is the only method narrative. I already mentioned that teens who commit to abstinence are less likely to successfully use other contraceptions. And one of the other things that kind of occurred to me, and I couldn't find any information for this, but it seems like if you're also pushing the narrative that sex is only okay to explore after marriage, one of the other logical conclusions that I kind of thought up was that this may encourage marriage at an earlier age. So if you're really interested in sex and you have somebody that you're in a relationship with and it's okay, maybe it's not the best, but you want to have sex, then you might get married to that person earlier in your life than you would otherwise, or you might marry someone you wouldn't even marry normally. I shouldn't say normally, but you wouldn't marry outside of that context, just so that you can explore sex with that person. And then eventually you're either locked into that relationship due to your own beliefs or religious beliefs, or you end up having to get a divorce, which is a little strange to consider. So this is the various quotes and things that I found from my research. I would really recommend that people kind of stop and pause the video and read these, because there's a lot of interesting things in here. For instance, we've spent since 1981 over $2 billion on these programs, which is quite a bit for something that has been proven not to work. Some of the other statistics, such as only 15% of parents actually wanting these programs, was just kind of a little weird reaffirmation for me. One of the things, though, that I really also wanted to note was this does not just have local repercussions, because these programs are often also tied with our funding to other countries. So, for instance, the bottom quote there mentions that there's 15 countries, and I just kind of condensed past the names of each of those countries or the areas they are from that are affected by AIDS or HIV. At least 30% of the funding, 33% of the funding sent to them for the purpose of prevention has to be used in abstinence only programs, which, if you can, that just, to me, it seems like an attempt upon our government to spread a specific ideology outside of our own borders. Instead of coming to help these people in the situation in which they live, we instead are coming there and making kind of a judgment value on them. And another thing that's important to note with that is, in the areas we did that, those countries were less likely to successfully use condoms or other contraception. So not only are we going in there and we're spreading these messages, but it's actually hurting. It is counterproductive to the cause that we gave the money for, which is just mind-boggling to me. All right. So what I learned, I've talked a lot about what I've learned through studying this. Many of these policies are harmful to members of the LGBT community, and that stood out for me quite a bit, and slowed me up at times because when you're doing this research and you're reading about certain resources, and they'll refer to homosexual agenda, and then that talking about LGBT stuff is propaganda. It gets really heavy emotionally for me, and that kind of made me it put me on the defensive a lot for this. And it also it did slow me up a bit, hence I'm posting almost a week late. um, the abstinence only sexual risk avoidance programs can be used by non-federal agencies. That was huge for me. So these agencies can apply for these grants so long as they hit those 8 criteria. If they're a church, a group like the Heritage Foundation, just any non-profit group can apply for these, which is kind of, to me, really strange, because the criteria in there definitely favors a very, and I don't want to use this, but I'm going to use it, the conservative kind of mindset. So there's a very conservative mindset that is embodied by no sex until marriage. And so if you were a group like Planned Parenthood, this means that there's a whole line of funding that you can't participate in without underwriting your own message. Your organization is effectively kept out by the fact that kept out of from that funding by the fact that your message does not coincide with the requirements for the grant at all. And so it gets into this really edgy place where it's like, do you betray your message and get more money, or do you have less money but have a consistent message? And especially since these are very, at least they feel to me, very cultural judgments to have on the outlook of sex. I already mentioned that it was unexpectedly difficult for me to study this because I am a trans woman, and kind of delving into this brought me back to a lot of the places where I was when I started this transition, and when I was much younger as well. As a professional, this gave me a lot of insight into how these programs work, and how they may impact clients or people I'm working with, even. Because these programs, even if you aren't in a modern SRA, the abstinence programs, I believe many of us will be very familiar with them, because, like myself, that's what I grew up with. And it was very hard. Like, how do you have an adequate understanding of sex when all you've been shown about it is, that sex is risky behavior and you shouldn't engage in it, and then they don't tell you anything else about it. So for me, that was really interesting, because there's going to be a lot of clients, even if they're not currently in school, who it's either them or their partners who are going to have issues around sex that come from either misinformation or other forms of that. So what this means for our work, many of our clients or their partners will be familiar with abstinence only, and many of them will have misconceptions about what sex is. They might not even know about other forms of contraception, or if they do, they might not believe they're as effective as they are. They also might assume there's an inherent risk to sex, even with a consenting partner who they've been with for years. And in the area of the LGBT community, there's still a lot of fallout from these programs kind of pushing the narrative that anything outside of heteronormativity is unnatural, which is frankly not true. You can find a lot of homosexual activity inside the animal kingdoms and stuff like that. So it also kind of creates a stigma around sex that it's only good in marriage, and that it's only good if you're looking to have children. And so it feels very much like it's trying to disconnect the idea of sex from pleasure. And that's not the reality of it. I mean, sex is pleasurable. There's a reason why people have sex when they're not married. And to treat it like that's not the case is very kind of coercive. And also that that we're expecting adolescents to just effectively say no. Like at the beginning of this, when I put up the pen picture, just say no. It didn't work on drugs, and it's not likely to work on sex either. So we're going to have to do a lot of either direct sexual education for our clients and kind of help them understand what their sex lives could look like or what it might do. Or we're going to have to help facilitate them in exploring their sexual beliefs. We're going to have to help them figure out what resources they want to trust and what they kind of see as true about, I shouldn't say what they see as true, but how they learn to educate themselves around sex. That's a better way to put it. So that was my last slide. And I hope this hasn't been too long, but thank you for your time, and I hope this was informative. Otherwise, have a good day.